Welcome back to Helping Without Hurting in Short-Term Missions. This is session 3, and today we are going to learn why the world's poor are not helpless. Sometimes short-term teams place a heavy emphasis on doing things like giving away resources or completing a project for the poor, but we don't always think through the unintended consequences of our actions. In this session, Steve will explain what healthy poverty alleviation looks like and what that means for short-term teams.
When we look at poverty and poverty alleviation, we've got to recognize that not all poverty is created equal. And looking at what's created the situation of poverty is really important to understand what's the appropriate response. And there's 3 different kinds of response. One's called relief, another's called rehabilitation, another one's called development. So let's start with looking at relief work. Relief work is a response to some kind of crisis, something that's happened to somebody that's fundamentally out of their control. So it's easy to think about natural disasters. There's been a famine, there's been an earthquake, there's been a hurricane that's come through. Those are easy to see, but sometimes they're on a smaller basis. So you've got the woman who's come to your church and she's beaten because her man at home is on another drunken binge and he's out of control. And she's in a crisis in that moment. And so relief work is to try to stop the pain caused by the crisis. In the case of that woman, you get her shelter, call the police and make sure she's going to be safe. In the case of people losing their homes because of an earthquake, you provide temporary shelter. In the case of a famine, you're there to provide some kind of food and water to make sure people can get through the day with the right kind of nutrition. So relief work is incredibly important, and you have to do it well. The reality is you can't do relief work unless you're kind of ready to do it beforehand. You're going to have agencies that have already prepared for it so they can be there in the moment. When Haiti happened and there was an earthquake in January, sending relief teams in June is just inappropriate. Now, once you have relief work, you move into rehabilitation with people. It's getting people back on their feet. So it might, and the biggest dynamic in rehabilitation is people that have been affected by the crisis now have some role to play in getting back on their feet. So in Ethiopia, after a famine, one of the things that was done was a kind of a food for work program whereby the people went out and they planted trees. One of the issues in that area that helped cause the famine was some climate issues. There's a lot of deforestation. Trees were used not only for climate issues, but also used for fodder, also used for building. So people had to go and plant trees, and if they planted the amount of trees that they were given by the agency, by the ministry, then they received food for them and their family for a certain amount of days. In other situations, sometimes they do some other work and there's some kind of cash that they're given to go to the local market to buy what they need if local markets are functioning. So it'll differ depending on the context, but the idea that's fundamental is people are getting a lot of help, but they're doing something to receive that help. And one of the problems we have is that outsiders keep doing relief when it's really time to start moving into the rehabilitation mode. But the bigger issue is the issue of development. 90% of poverty in the world is not caused because of crises that demands a relief or rehabilitation response. There are deeper issues that are embedded in structures and people's lives and in history and a whole bunch of really complex issues. And so development is that long-term digging in and looking at those deeper issues and looking at what are possibilities to bring change in health, change in education, bring change in economic opportunities. And that doesn't happen fast. And the key issue of development is not doing things for people, but rather walking with people. Individuals and communities that are looking at their lives and making decisions for their future and saying, how do we get there? And you walking with them to help them succeed in that. And that's when you ask the question, what's poverty alleviation? That's it more than any other thing. And so it's obvious as we enter in a short-term mission trip for a week, you're going to have very little opportunity to deeply impact or deeply alleviate people's poverty. It's just not real to think that that is going to happen at any kind of deep and meaningful level. And that's part of the reason why this whole setup is not go do and do for the poor. Because this is just an inappropriate vehicle for really doing that. So that's why we're saying go and look at it, watch it, see it in action, understand it better, so that you can understand better for your own life, what would it mean for me to help good poverty alleviation in my own communities and communities in my nation and communities around the world.
I am Svart, son of Skop, of the House of Sklood. We come from a land far beyond the Great Sea. We have heard that this is a place of great darkness, of frail, powerless people. We have come to help. The people of this realm have many problems. Most of them are bewitched by these small, flat magic stones. It's really quite sad. The men don't work. There's no pillaging, no plundering, no marauding. They just sit, enslaved by these strange glowing devices, forced to endlessly tap, 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 over and over. It's a meaningless existence. Breaks your heart. Be free! Be free, my brothers! When you can help someone less fortunate than you, there's no better feeling. It's why we came. They need to learn a better way. Our way. They need help with things that just seem so basic to us. These poor, wretched urchins are starving. Act like you like it, don't embarrass them. This is what passes for a meal here. This, a meal. We can help.
What is that?
Seal blubber. She's moved to tears. You see how great the meat is here? Delicious. Look at this guy. So cute, but so weak. He should be able to take down a full-grown whale by now. We do this thing called VBS. It's been a huge success. The kids love Viking Battle School. Look at these rags. These people are truly destitute. How will this in battle ever stop a halberd from spilling their innards? That's why we've handed out over 100 Brynja. Just look at them. They've never seen such nice clothing. We've accomplished so much in just a few days. We helped someone who couldn't get his horseless cart to go. We've taught them better ways to use their unusually small fields. And as on most of these trips, lots of painting. These guys literally have no idea how to discourage their enemies from attacking. This has been an amazing trip, and look how happy they are. They just love us so much. And just because we are vastly superior to them in every possible way, doesn't mean that we haven't gotten as much as we've given. When we can bless them with the simple things that we take for granted, it makes you feel good.
Wow. Thanks for the catapult. It's great.
If you go back to the definition of poverty, poverty alleviation isn't just about fixing the material poor's circumstances. It's about helping them discover that they are an image bearer, and that they have tremendous value as a human being, and that they are called to be a steward of their resources and opportunities. When we visit a community, we have to be incredibly careful that we respect that process, not undermine it. One of the great shifts that's happened in the last 30 years in poverty alleviation is moving away from a needs-based approach to what's called an asset-based approach in poverty alleviation. A needs-based approach says, yeah, there's problems in a community and there's basically nothing there to deal with a problem. And so the implication is all the answers, all the resources have to come from the outside. Asset-based community development says, yeah, there's problems, but there's resources there's in a community and in a person's life. They have knowledge, they have social networks, they even have economic resources. One of the great changes in microfinance internationally has been the recognition that poor can and do save. The poorest of the poor know how to save. And so there are resources that are there, and a key issue then in asset-based community development is taking the time and working hard to identify those resources and then to mobilize them, to put them into action. And outside resources are going to be needed often, but they only are there to build upon those inside, internal resources. Another key aspect of community development is the idea of the participation of the poor in their own life change. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it's easy to forget that it's their lives, not our lives. It's their children, not our children. It's their community, not our community. It's their church, not our church. And they're responsible before the Lord to be who they're supposed to be and to carry out their responsibilities. And we can be there to encourage them. When you're working long-term with people, that's where you start getting to the issues of how do you help people address issues, how to help people have the courage to change things, take on things, try new things. But as an outsider popping in for a week, it's not really our job to go before people and try to lead them in some new direction. It's just an inappropriate dynamic. What's the opposite of asset-based participatory development? Well, it's basically being paternalistic. And paternalism's been defined as habitually doing things for people they can do for themselves, or providing things for people they can provide for themselves. And this gets manifested in so many different ways. Do you really think that poor people in a community can't paint their houses, can't put up weather stripping, can't plant their own crops? Do you really think churches don't have the ability to teach their children through something like a VBS? So we look at this and being paternalistic, we want to just jump in. We want to jump in and make things happen. And we as Americans, by the way, are particularly prone to this because of something called internal locus control, the idea that every problem needs to be solved and needs to be solved now. So we look at this 1 week opportunity to jump in there and to make things happen. And in doing that, not only do we sometimes actually physically do things for people, we actually kind of take over and say, well, this is what you should do. And we take over spiritually. We say, well, this is what God is all about. And we have insights, obviously, the church in North America does, but do we really think we've got the lock and key to the gospel? And that our brothers and sisters in other contexts don't know God? So this needs to be more of a dialogue, but certainly not us coming in and saying we've got the answers. And I'm really concerned because there's been a shift as people have looked at poverty and they've come in and said, okay, I get it that we're not supposed to go do these projects. We're just going to go teach. And I want to really challenge that assumption. There's a difference between going and teaching and going and entering into a dialogue. And part of what should happen in a short-term missions context is not teaching, it's way more dialogue. So why on short-term mission trips do we tend to be paternalistic? I mean, it's just a reality, it happens. There's a couple obvious reasons. One, we want to serve. We really do care. And out of that motivation, we just can't stand by. And so we're hoping that as you understand better what poverty is and poverty alleviation, that'll help you not feel the need to jump in. Because guys, it's not a question of whether they have a well or not. It's a question of how did that well come into being. That's what development's about. It's not just the thing, it's the how it got there. And so don't get all caught up in producing some product during your week. I think a second reason we tend to be real paternalistic in short-term mission trips is just we want some kind of sense of I've made a difference, and there's kind of an emotional high to that. Look, I've stepped out of my comfort zone and look at what I've kind of done. And we would never quite say that, but we like that kind of emotional high that comes out of that, and that sense of I've been out there and I've stepped out in faith and served. We had talked earlier about the idea of the poverty of the rich being labeled as a God complex, the idea we want to kind of play God in the lives of the poor, and we just have to set that aside. So when you go on this trip and you see something that's possible, and you think, oh, give me some tools, give me some cement, we could fix this now, resist that temptation. Your job is to be a follower, a listener, a learner. Set aside your desire to be a leader, to be the one that makes the difference in that 7 days in a community. Set that aside for the sake of the poor.
When we look at poverty, we have to consider what is the most appropriate response. Some parts of the world, or even some individuals, need crisis relief right now. But one of the most important things that Steve mentioned is that the vast majority of materially poor communities don't need paternalistic relief work. In those communities, we have to support the long-term process of development instead. As you spend the next few minutes talking about the video, think through how you can walk alongside those you are going to visit. Ask God to open your eyes to see and celebrate the gifts He has already placed in their community. We'll see you next time.